Imagine that you are imprisoned for 99 years in one of the most dangerous prisons, from which escaping is almost impossible. There is a high wall with electric wires and guard towers. A place that is classified as one of the strongest prisons in America. Would you accept the reality? And you will not be crazy like the hero of our story and do the impossible and carry out more than one escape operation, one more complicated than the other. Brush Mountain Prison in Tennessee is one of the most remote prisons in America and was established in 1896. This place is heavily guarded and for most prisoners, remember going without return and is nicknamed the end of the line because it was considered impossible to get out or escape from it and at any moment you could be killed by other prisoners. In addition, the location of the prison was at the end of a valley, meaning very far from the city, and whoever entered it was as if he was isolated from the world. The process of escaping from it, no matter how skilled and criminal the prisoner was and spent his life in and out of prisons, is an almost impossible process, but there was a prisoner who decided to prove the opposite and escape from this prison in a brilliant way. His name is James Earl Ray James, born in 103927. He has a long history of robberies, murders and prison escapes. He was one of the most famous killers in America. The reason for this fame is that on April 4, 1968, he assassinated Martin Luther King Jr. This person was a leader in the civil rights movement in America and was known for his contributions against racism and social injustice. According to what was mentioned, James was a racist and that is why he assassinated him. But for me, James did not initially state the reason for the assassination and said that there were groups that forced him to carry out this operation. Anyway, my good people, after the assassination, they arrested James in 1970 and sentenced him to 99 years in prison. Of course, they sent him to Brush Mountain Prison, which we talked about as I told you. James had a long history of crimes and escapes. 3 years before the assassination of Martin Luther, he escaped from Missouri State Prison. This escape operation was imaginary. At that time, he was imprisoned on charges of armed robbery and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. At that time, he was working in the bakery affiliated with the prison he was in, and he was watching. Every day a truck would arrive and take the bread they were making and take it to other prisons. He and another prisoner with him wondered how he could escape from prison using this truck. After planning well, he decided to hide inside one of the cardboard boxes they used to put the bread in. He actually entered the box and his colleagues put the bread on top of him so that he could no longer be seen by anyone. There were a lot of them in this box so no one could see him. Then the truck headed to another prison. When it suddenly stopped on the road, he jumped out of it and hid in a junkyard. Then he fled the place. Then he carried out the assassination of Martin Luther King. After the assassination, they arrested him at Heathrow Airport in London and returned to America. Then they sent him to Brush Mountain Prison, which we talked about at the beginning of the story. Of course, after he was imprisoned, the thing that occupied his mind the most was escaping from prison. He tried to stay as far away as possible from the eyes of the guards and prisoners. He also did not like to show himself in front of anyone. He liked to remain mysterious all the time, but how could he think? Escape from this impregnable fortress, a prison that is like an isolated castle and is designed to make every dream of escaping from prison impossible. The prison walls are 5 meters high and 1 meter thick, and not only that, but also the walls had barbed wire and the wires were electrified with a force of 20,000 volts, meaning that anyone who touched the wires would be considered a farewell and would actually know that he was escaping from prison. Of course, this was a deterrent to all the prisoners so that they would not think of escaping from prison. In addition to the barbed wire, you have 9 guard towers surrounding the prison, and on each tower there is an armed guard ready to shoot anyone who tries to escape. So when our friend James Earl saw all these obstacles, he was sure that the best way to escape was from underground. One day in 1970, when he was inside the cell, he began examining everything, the walls, the ceiling, the floor. He was trying to find any weak point to use to escape, and the first thing that came to his mind was to cut the poles and escape through the corridor somehow, but he immediately rejected this idea because it was somewhat stupid for this prison. Then he turned his attention to the ventilation hole that was in his cell. This hole was at the bottom behind the bed and its size was small, meaning that a person could fit through it, and there was something like a protective net on it, and fixed with 4 screws. When James removed this mesh, he discovered that he could dig through the wall using a spoon or any piece of metal, and of course his goal was to enter through this hole so that he could know where it would lead him, and indeed every night after the justice issues to the prisoners, he would remove the mesh and dig a little so that no one would notice what he was doing inside the cell. And of course the most important thing was that there were no guards outside checking on the prisoners. Now, most of the time, I was alone in the cell, but sometimes a random person would sleep with him, so he would pay attention and did not tell anyone at first about his operation. After several weeks of digging, I was able to enter through this hole, and here he discovered the passage of pipes. This passage was designed to ventilate the cells in the prison, meaning it draws air from all the cells, and at the end there is a huge fan that draws this air and enters outside the prison, and these passages were large, meaning that it easily pulls a person inside. James was amazed. This is the best way they could use to escape from prison, and he was able to bypass the huge fan and the poles in front of it. There were poles in front of it. He was happy to go out to the prison yard because this fan was overlooking the outer courtyard directly, but he did not understand what the next step was. Let's assume that he reached the courtyard. What would he do next? He would definitely see the guards on the towers. The next day, when he went out to the courtyard, he noticed an opening in the ground. When he studied the place carefully, he remembered that next to the prison there was a power generation station. As we mentioned, the prison was in a remote area, and the best thing was to generate electricity for it. This station was the one that generated the energy. He knew immediately that this opening in the ground would lead to the station. He thought that if he entered it after exiting the huge fan that was 6 meters away, it would definitely lead directly to the station via a steam pipe extending from the prison to the station. He reached there, so he would definitely be able to escape easily. Maybe the idea did not reach some of you. We will repeat it very quickly. James will enter from the opening in his cell and will reach the fan that overlooks the prison courtyard. From there, he will walk 6 meters until he reaches the opening. He is supposed to pass through a pipe in this opening until he reaches the power station, and from there he will escape. But here the first obstacle in front of him is the pipe in front of the fan. He has to cut them to cross and get out to the yard. Of course, here he needed an iron saw blade. Where would he get it? It is impossible for him to escape from the outside. Such things will definitely be exposed, but James used a very ingenious method that will definitely amaze you. James asked for his brother's help outside the prison to escape with one blade, and his brother's name is Jerry. Told him, "Perfect. The subject is that I have a fart and cut his shoe from the bottom and put a small saw blade inside it so that it would not be exposed, and then he glued the shoe and went to visit his brother in prison. During that time, the shoe he was wearing was exactly the same as his brother's shoe, the same color and the same size. When the guard left them, they immediately left their shoes and changed them together as if nothing had happened. After the visit ended, James went to the cell and took out the blade and began the process of cutting the stitches so that he could pass outside. Of course, the process was not easy at all. It took him several months until he finished. Unfortunately, the obstacles did not end there. Rather, he had a bigger problem than cutting the stitches, which are the second blades of the fan, because he did not have room to pull them out from under them and pass through the other end of the fan. There were also 2 stitches that he had to cut and pass through, so he did not have any stability at all. Here, in order to overcome the problem of the second blade, he had to seek help from another person, but this time not his brother, but one of his few friends in prison. The person he sought help from was named Jake Morlock. Keep in mind that this Jake and all the people who we will mention them later. He does not have real pictures of them, and all the pictures that you will see will be pictures of actors. Jake, this was James's most trusted person in prison, and since he was an honest person, he told him that he was planning to escape. Jake was happy and liked the idea, but on one condition: he would escape with James. He told him, "Okay, I have no problem with that." Of course, the reason James used Jake was that he was a plumber in the prison workshop and had access to the equipment that James would need. They were happy to use the required equipment, and James would go down and bend the fan blades and complete the escape process. But the problem that they also faced here was that Jake was living in a cell other than James's cell, and they had to be together to deliver the equipment. On May 2, 1971, a random person was supposed to sleep in James' cell. The details of the prisoners' names were written by one of the guards on a notebook, and any of the prisoners could reach this notebook. So James decided to change the name of the person who would come to the cell to the name of his friend Jake. To hand over the equipment and escape. Of course, the operation was dangerous. If any of the guards were exposed, he would be punished, but fortunately, that day was a holiday and the number of guards was less than usual, so he changed the names without anyone noticing him at all. When Jake went to him in the evening, he gave him a pipe wrench and several other things. I don't know how he escaped them from the maintenance workshop, but it is said that since he repairs some things in the prisoners' cells, he was able to escape them without anyone noticing him. Anyway, after the guards finished the evening count, the 2 partners began the escape operation. Here, James entered and bent the fan blades and was able to reach the prison search, but here he did not complete it, of course, and turned around and returned to his cell. Several days ago, he had prepared toilet paper dolls for him and his friend to put on their beds so that after they entered through the opening, the guards would not notice that they were there. The dolls were in the shape of human heads, so they placed them under the blankets and he got out through the opening. Here, he had a difficult problem for Jake. Due to his excess weight, it was impossible for him to enter. From this opening, James basically had a way to get in, so there was no other choice but for James to escape alone. It was supposed that before the morning countdown at 6 in the morning, he would have escaped and disappeared from the place. Indeed, at 2:45, he was coming out of the fan opening, and at that time, he had planned with his brother Jerry in advance that after he left on the specified day, he would be waiting for him in the parking lot that he had specified in advance, so that he could take him and escape from the place. Indeed, Jerry was ready and waiting for him impatiently. On the other hand, James was able to get out of the opening. The fan went straight to the hole from which he would go down, but here he discovered that this operation was very dangerous. The guards on the towers were constantly monitoring the place, and if they noticed him, he would be gone. They worked hard for nothing, and they might even kill him. But he kept watching the situation until the opportunity was right. Here he lifted the cover of the hole to go down, but here he was shocked by the amount of steam coming out. The temperature under it was literally unbearable. The pain he felt at the first lift was unbearable. The disaster was that within a few seconds he had to decide whether to go in and resist this terrible heat and get burned, or go back and forget about the escape. Of course, he decided to go down and resist the pain. All of it would be insignificant compared to freedom. After he went down, he was exposed to very severe burns and much more pain than he expected, to the point that he could not resist and decided to go back. But the biggest disaster was that after he got out of the hole, one of the guards noticed him and immediately arrested him and discovered everything he had done. The hole in the cell and the dolls he had made and the fan had opened. And they went and got tired, all for nothing, and returned again to the most secure cell. I don't know what happened regarding his friend Jake. Did they punish him as well or not? Nothing was mentioned about him. As for Jerry's brother, after waiting for several hours, he was sure that something had happened to his brother and made him cancel the operation. Suddenly, while he was returning, he heard on the radio that prisoner James Ray had been arrested while trying to escape from Brush Mountain Prison. Before James could be sent to another cell, they sent him to the prison clinic to be treated for the burns he had sustained. The burns were second and subsequent degree. You see, subsequent degree burns are considered very dangerous and cause the destruction of layers of skin. Anyway, after he was treated, he remained in prison for 5 years without any attempt to escape because he basically didn't see any suitable method that he could implement. During that period in 1976, he was working in the prison laundry, a section where prisoners' clothes were washed. One day, he was making a hole in a pipe that was 1 meter long and a bit thrown in one of the corners of the laundry. So he started collecting them and hiding them behind the sink without anyone noticing him. Here you might wonder what he wanted with these tubes. James, as smart as he was collecting these tubes in the hope of using them if he got a suitable opportunity to escape. 3 years later, one day, while he was walking around searching the prison, he noticed something strange in one of the corners of the prison wall. There was a gap of about 50 centimeters between the wall and the barbed wire above. This gap was enough for a person to slip through and escape into the valley without being electrocuted. He was surprised that he was able to climb this wall. He was happy that he could escape easily, but how could this process be done in the first place, and how would the guards on the towers not notice him? We will know this point in the events of the story when James thought to himself. He mentioned the tubes he was collecting in the prison sink and thought that he could make a ladder out of these tubes to climb the wall. It was a terrible idea, but the amount of tubes he had on hand was not enough, so he needed to include some people with him in this process to collect the tubes. They make peace and escape all their verses together because in the end one hand does not clap, so the first person he brought with him was a prisoner named Doug Shelton. This man, like James, had a history full of escape operations. His job in this prison was a plumber, the same job as our friend Jake, who we talked about before, but Doug was responsible for the plumbing and had the authority to access different tools that would be necessary for their operation. At the same time, he had experience in this field and knew how it was necessary. They put the pieces together to make a ladder, and also by virtue of his job he had some authority to move around with tools, and the second person that James added with them was a prisoner named Earl Hill. This person was his cellmate. He did not have a specific job. He would help them with anything he could get his hands on. James did not add these prisoners randomly, but rather chose them from among all the prisoners because he knew that they were honest and would not betray him, because some prisoners, when they knew that a prisoner was planning to escape, would go to the officials and spoil him, and their goal was to get rewards or reduce their sentence, so these two people were not of that type. Anyway, After the trio agreed on all the details of the plan, they began to steal pieces of pipes from everywhere slowly, and then they began to hide them in the back section of the yard, a place like a small hole in the ground, and no one would go to it or see anyone from afar, and there they hid all their pieces and covered them with leaves so that if anyone reached there, they would not notice them. The method of smuggling the pipes out was difficult. It was very tiring if any of the guards discovered them. He was happy that their plan had failed, so they would sometimes hide them inside their clothes and avoid the guards while they were going out to the yard. Or for example, two of them would distract the guards and one would smuggle the pieces outside. At the same time, they knew the guards' routine and knew when to search the prisoners and when not. In other words, they would succeed in some way. Meanwhile, they were monitoring the guard on the nearest tower to the gap from which they would jump out. They were trying to study his behavior and his guarding style while they were in the yard. They discovered that this was the easiest guard among all the guards on the towers because he had a specific routine. When the prisoners went out for a break, he would start reading a newspaper and would not leave it until he finished it. Of course, since his job was boring and routine, he would look for anything to amuse himself with. There was nothing better than reading at the time and collecting some information from them, such as inside information about the guards or monitoring them and such things. He would take a monthly subscription from some of the prisoners for a certain amount in exchange for washing their clothes in the prison laundry. He would give them benefits such as VIP. After that, he asked Jerry's brother, who was outside, for help once. Sometimes he would visit the prison and give James some details about his plan, or he would write him coded messages in a certain way so that no one could understand them except him, and he would send them to him by mail. On May 17, 1977, he wrote him a letter and told him that he had to bury a bag in a certain place near the prison so that he could use it after the escape. Jerry did what he was told and buried the bag and put inside it hair dye, a coat, food supplies, first aid kits and a gun, meaning everything he might need after the escape. On June 9, 1977, before the escape, the trio James, Doug and Earl met for the last time to research the prison and decided that they had enough pipe pieces to make a ladder and they were ready to escape at 6 o'clock on Friday, June 10. 1997. The prisoners went out to exercise and in the meantime the escape operation officially began. The first thing James did was bribe one of the prisoners to make a fake fight between him and other prisoners in a place far from the escape site, as they put the pieces together and escaped by ladder to the outside. He actually gave him a secret signal and the fight began between the prisoners and the guards began to finish them off. The amazing thing here, according to Jamisa memory, was that there were only 3 or 4 guards in the yard, of course, not counting the guards on the towers. When the fight began, James, Doug and Earl got on the ladder within a few minutes and lifted James up and leaned against the wall. But here a disaster happened to him that was enough to ruin everything he did. When James lifted the ladder by mistake, an electrical contact occurred between him and the electric wire at the top. Since the ladder was made of metal, James was struck by a light electric shock, but because of it he fainted for several seconds. Here, Doug and Earl tried to wake him up and gave him 3 slaps to advise him. He pulled himself together and got back on his feet and climbed the ladder and escaped into the valley. Of course, immediately after Doug and Earl jumped and ran away too, leaving the ladder in its place. Here, some will say, "By God, you're laughing at us." Well, the guard on the tower near them didn't see them putting down the ladder and climbing it. The strange thing, guys, is that even though the 3 of them escaped and despite the fight that was happening between the prisoners below, the guard was in another world. Man, a fight was happening between the prisoners. He was holding the newspaper and reading and wasn't interested in the matter at all. They understood the extent of the guards' negligence in this prison. The guards, who were on the other towers, also didn't notice the escaping prisoners at all. After the 3 of them escaped, a few seconds later, some of the prisoners noticed the ladder they had put down, so they ran towards it to take advantage of the opportunity as well. The same thing happened, and the guard near the tower didn't notice them at all. Other than the 3, James, Doug and Earl, 3 others were able to escape in the same way. After them, there was a prisoner working in the prison kitchen, so he started running too to escape, but since his clothes were white, so one of the guards noticed him, and when he saw him climbing the ladder, he aimed his weapon at him and shot him, killing him. Just after the 3rd or 4th bullet was fired, the sleepy guard realized that something wrong was happening around him, but after what? The escaped prisoners disappeared from the place. Half an hour after the escape, the 6 escapees were running between the rugged mountains, hoping to reach a residential area and be able to escape from there. Of course, when the guards counted the prisoners in prison, they knew that 6 had escaped, so they closed the prison and began a wide-scale chase. Helicopters, security personnel, and the FBI, with police dogs everywhere, a police patrol in bulk. Man, they didn't leave a place without combing how one of the most notorious killers in America could escape from prison. But James Hoon was in big trouble. After the six escaped, they separated from each other, and he was left alone. He was trying to find the bag that Jerry's brother had buried, the bag that we said he had put the gun and food supplies inside, which were the things, but the disaster is that he didn't find it and he doesn't know where. His brother buried him, so he was forced to flee randomly through the forests. The worst thing was that he could not find any food or water, and basically he did not know where he was going. Within 48 hours, the other 5 prisoners were all arrested and returned to prison. The FBI, police, soldiers, and their dogs were searching everywhere they could find them. After 51 hours of escaping, one of the dogs suddenly smelled a scent and recognized James. When he followed the scent, they found him burying himself under a pile of leaves and immediately surrendered himself without any resistance. The disaster is that he was only 6 miles away from the highway, meaning he was going in the wrong direction. If he had reached there, he could have somehow escaped using a car or any other means. Unfortunately, after this crazy escape attempt, they returned him to the same prison he was in, and he remained imprisoned in it until he died on 2/34/1998. As for Brush Mountain Prison, it remained operational until 2009, after which it was closed and turned into a tourist site. What do you think? Was James a smart escapee, or could he have used different tactics to make his escape successful? Write to me in the comments, and this way we have reached the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe.